1984, many years ago, when I was young and had no gray hair, when I was president of a computer services company here in Houston, and I got asked to give a talk on free enterprise for the Hugh O'Brien Youth Leadership Foundation. They put on these big seminars for high school students about leadership, and one of the elements is free enterprise. So I gave a talk on free enterprise, and this little white-haired guy, all enthusiastic, came running up to me afterwards and said, "I've agreed with everything you said." And I thought, well, that's very unusual. People almost never say that, and frankly, often I don't agree with everything I've said. So, but who was this gentleman? That was Rollin Story in 1984, who I'd also given a talk at the program. Rollin, the first president and founding force behind the Free Enterprise Institute. So in 1984, I was busy running a small company, but he talked me into being on the advisory board, which he assured me would take no time. Of course, those of you who remember Rollin know that within 2 or 3 weeks, I got a call, "Would you come judge a high school speech contest?" And I thought, no, I wouldn't. Well, I mean, I'm busy. No, well, you don't just say no to Rollin. Rollin will keep talking to you about it. And he said, "I want you to come judge this high school speech contest. We have a contest where high school students give talks on the 10 pillars of economic wisdom. And you'll hear some interesting kids, and you can judge the work we're doing." Okay. One of the first contests that I judged, which turned out to be more than one, of course, there were many, there was a lot of good students in it. And we got to about the 4th or 5th guy, and this kid got up there, and he gave a speech that, frankly, was better than 90% of the faculty and politicians that I've known over the last 22 years here. And the kid was, I don't know, 14? Who is this person? And the student would leave the room, and then the judges would make some comments, and then we'd tell the next kid to come in, and we kind of looked at each other like, why should we tell anybody else to come in? And that's exactly what happened. The next ones came in, but no one could top this kid. This happened 4 years in a row at the school, and I started to wonder if somebody was going to poison him or, break his alarm clock or something, because there was no chance to win that contest with this participant. And that kid in 1984 was Ted Cruz. Now, let me just say, I sometimes get the question, because a lot of the people who are involved with us like to be involved with politics, and they support political candidates and think tanks and parties, and that's great. That's very important work. But so I often get the question, well, what are you doing that's changing things now? What are you going to do to stop the current political activities or candidate or office holder? And my answer is very little. The effect we have is normally, with very few exceptions, not today. Our effect is changing minds and hearts over long periods of time, especially with our work with students. So let me just say to those supporters, and I know there are some of you in the room, who are supporting the Free Enterprise Institute in 1984 and 85 and 86 and 87, if you're sitting there going, gee, when is Winston going to have an effect? When is the Free Enterprise Institute going to make a difference? Well, after, 26 years, 25 years later, here's a student who you could say we had some effect on. And he's done pretty well for himself. He still doesn't have gray hair, but he's senator-elect. I think something went wrong there in the schedule. I missed that. I do have a plan, though, if you're elected president, for getting me appointed senator, because I don't want to run. That looks very uncomfortable. But I would like to be appointed. So if, as we're thinking about the future, I just want to mention that, plant a seed. So it is really, you can understand why it is such a real honor and really somewhat emotional for me after all these years of knowing Ted, watching the wonderful work he's done and work he did as clerking in the Supreme Court and as Solicitor General of the state of Texas, to now be able to introduce him to you as an alum of our program and a member of our Board of Trustees and the next senator from the great state of Texas, Ted Cruz.
Winston, thank you so much for that very, very kind introduction. Thank you for the terrific reception. You know, what I want to say to everyone here, first of all, is just thank you so much. There are a lot of men and women in this room who have been tremendous supporters and friends. We've been through the last 2 years a magical, incredible journey. And I will, you know, this is the first opportunity I've had to do a public event since the election night, Tuesday night. And I'm very, very glad it is an opportunity to be with each of you this morning. It truly has been magical, and I appreciate the sacrifices, the friendship, and the commitment of the men and women in this room to liberty. Now, Tuesday was a bittersweet night. It was encouraging in terms of the results here in Texas, but it was not a good night nationally. It was a lousy night nationally. And what I want to talk about this morning is three things. Number one, these are perilous times. Number two, our nation will endure. And number three, we have to win the argument. You know, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin commented that he had spent much of the convention looking at George Washington in the presiding chair. And at the back of his chair, there was carved the image of a sun. And what Dr. Franklin said is, I've spent much of this convention contemplating that sun and wondering whether it was rising or setting. And at long last, at the end of this convention, I can tell you it is a rising and not a setting sun. That is surely still the case today. But these are perilous times. The elections on Tuesday have ushered in what are going to be a very challenging 4 years ahead of us. The last 4 years, our national debt went from $10 trillion to $16 trillion. It is now larger than our entire gross domestic product. The last 4 years, our GDP growth has averaged 1.5%. Less than half the historical average. For the last 70 years, it's been 3.3%. The last 4 years, we've seen 23 million people out of work. Millions of people giving up their job search, not even looking. The unemployment numbers understate what we have because so many people have deemed it hopeless. And the next 4 years, I fear we're going to see more of the same, and it ain't going to be pretty. If we continue on our current path of spending and deficits, 4 years from now, our national debt won't be $16 trillion. It'll be over $20 trillion. If we continue and on the current path, one of the biggest fights we have coming, that's going to come very, very soon, is taxes. The President and Harry Reid have, by all appearances, taken the election as a mandate. That the American people want more of the same. Harry Reid has already said one of the first things he's going to do in the Senate is try to limit filibusters so that those pesky minority party can have even less influence. The only encouraging thing about that is if it follows the current pattern, the Senate hadn't done anything the last few years. We're going to see a fight over the fiscal cliff coming in about 10 minutes, with the Bush tax cuts all expiring. A massive tax increase as our economy teeters on the precipice of recession. And by all appearances after the election, this administration is only going to be emboldened that the answer to the economy is to jack up taxes on small businesses and entrepreneurs and job creators. And we are going to see the locusts of federal regulators descending on this economy. As bad as the last few years have been, and we've never seen regulation like we have in the last few years, I fear the next few years will be even worse, because they will not be checked by the prospect of another election for the resident of the White House. In particular, the energy industry, which has such incredible promise to generate the economic growth we need to turn our country around. The coal industry, this president began his administration by saying, you can build another coal plant in this country, but we'll bankrupt it. That's where he started before he was emboldened by re-election. Coal industry is in real trouble. The oil and gas industry, there's been a brief respite on the campaign trail where the administration has talked about oil and gas. In fact, the State of the Union last year, y'all may not have noticed this, but the president actually explained that he personally invented fracking. In the next 4 years, I think the oil and gas industry is going to face enormous challenges from Washington. I think we are going to see a direct and frontal assault on fracking coming from the federal government. As Texans, we find that hard to believe. You know, I like to point out, if you go up to the Marcellus Shale, it doesn't end at the Pennsylvania-New York border, but the jobs do. You step north of that border, and the knucklehead politicians in New York won't allow fracking. So those resources are there, but apparently the people of New York don't want jobs. Pennsylvania is seeing an explosion of jobs. New York's not seeing any of them because you can't access those resources. And that doesn't even begin to touch foreign policy. The next 4 years in foreign policy, I think we face the prospect of a nuclear Iran. I think the nation of Israel faces extraordinary jeopardy because it appears now quite likely Israel will have to act unilaterally to try to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And I have very significant fears that this administration will not be there with the nation of Israel, and indeed may well lead efforts in the United Nations to cut the limb out from under Israel when Israel acts to protect its national security and vicariously ours. These are perilous times, which is a lousy way to begin a breakfast. But let me make my second point. Our nation will endure. You know, election night, we had a victory party. We had a terrific margin in the Senate race. A lot of people who should have been celebrating in some ways. And yet it was very, very hard to celebrate as the numbers started coming in, as we started realizing what was happening across this country. And I had a lot of people who poured time and energy, who were in tears, looking at what is happening to our great country. How do we survive this? And let me give you a message of encouragement. Our nation will endure. This nation has enjoyed providential blessing from the very days of our founding. When the nation was formed, we fought a revolution against the most powerful military might in the world. We were outgunned, outmanned, outsupplied, and we prevailed. We endured a civil war that would have destroyed lesser nations, and yet we endured. We endured 2 world wars, won them, and brought a period of global peace and prosperity. We endured the stagflation of the 1970s. I just watched last night. I took my mom out to see a movie, and we went to see Argo. If you haven't seen it, by the way, it's a fantastic movie I mean, it really, really is good. It's a true story of 6 hostages in Iran during the Iran hostage crisis who were successfully smuggled out. It is, if you haven't seen it, go and take your family. One of the best movies I've ever seen. But watching it last night made you remember a previous time when the economy was struggling, when the president lacked the fortitude to stand for the United States. And yet we didn't just endure that, we came roaring back. And we will again, because I am absolutely convinced the fortitude of the American people, the love of liberty that characterizes Americans is unparalleled. And at the end of the day, we're called to do all we can to pour our hearts and souls and mights and do everything we can. And then ultimately it's in God's hands. But our nation will endure, and we've got to keep at it. And that leads to the third point. How do we turn things around? How do we endure? How do we stop these perilous threats and turn things around? And the answer is very, very simple. We have got to win the argument. Margaret Thatcher famously said, first you win the argument, then you win the election. You know, Brian, that was fantastic. I'm sorry to tell you there's virtually no member of the United States Congress who could deliver 10% of that content, or who even knows it, much less could deliver it. Look, we are fundamentally right. Freedom works. Free markets work. But we got to tell the story. We have to explain why. An interesting illustration. First presidential debate between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. Much celebrated. Everyone concluded, rightly I think, that Romney had won that debate. Yet I'll tell you, there was a statement he made there that I think encapsulated the problem. He was talking about cutting taxes, talking about restricting regulation. And Mitt Romney said, what I'm proposing has never been tried before, never been done before. I got to tell you, I started yelling at my television set. What are you talking about that it's never been tried before or done before? It has been the pattern over and over and over again for economic prosperity. None of this stuff is complicated. But a lot of people don't know it. Young people, Bob talked about the young people who overwhelmingly voted for more of the same. Who do you think is going to pay the $16 trillion debt? Look, every young person should have come out of the polls and slugged their parents and grandparents. We're bankrupting the country, and the kids are saying, hey, thanks a lot. Sorry, guys, you're getting stuck with a bill. But who's making that case? Who's telling young people? Where is your future if this kind of debt is what's being put upon you? Hispanics. One of the lessons of this election that all of the pundits are saying is, well, the president got 71% of the Hispanic vote. That demonstrates that free market stuff doesn't work. We got to go into full pander. We got to be every bit as big government as Barack Obama to possibly compete with demographic change. Poppycock. What utter nonsense. The Hispanic community is an incredibly entrepreneurial community. You know, there are 2.3 million Hispanics in this country who are small business owners. There are roughly 50 million Hispanics in America. If you assume 2 per household, that means 1 in 10 Hispanic households are small business owners. But who was making that case? And what has the avenue been for economic advancement from the beginning of our country? It's been small businesses. It has been entrepreneurs. You know, I'll tell you in my family story, going back a couple of generations. My grandfather in Cuba, when he was a teenager, his father died. My grandfather worked on a sugarcane plantation in Cuba, in what was a company town, where they didn't pay him wages. They paid them credits at the company store, which meant they were trapped and could never leave. It was literally generational servitude. When my dad was a teenager, a bus came through town trying to round up people for a political rally. They offered people $5 and a sandwich. My grandfather jumped on that bus, said, "I'm taking the $5 and the sandwich, and I'm never coming back." And he went to a beach town in Cuba. He found a fruit stand on the beach. And he went to work at the fruit stand. For the next couple of years, my grandfather slept on the floor of that fruit stand, lived in the fruit stand, selling fruit. A couple of years later, the owner of the fruit stand bought a larger store, and my grandfather had saved up enough money to buy that fruit stand from the owner and begin as a small business owner. 55 years ago, my father then fled Cuba. In 1957, with nothing, he was 18, had $100 in his underwear. Now that shows you inflation. My grandfather took $5, my dad needed $100. Came to the United States, worked his way through UT washing dishes, and started a small business in the oil and gas industry. That has been the avenue for economic advancement over and over and over again. That is how people climb the economic ladder. But we got to tell that story. Who's telling that story? Who is explaining? The last 4 years, Hispanic unemployment has gone up faster than the unemployment in the rest of the economy. Went up to over 10%. African American unemployment went up to over 14%. Who is telling the story that if you want to climb the economic ladder, the worst thing that can happen is for you to get on the dole, for you to start getting government benefits and to see your responsibility, your self-reliance destroyed? But we're not telling that story. We're not explaining it to people. Instead, you have politicians that are offering bread and circuses. What can I give you? I can give you this, I can give you that. You know, Winston talked about the 10 pillars of economic wisdom. When I was 13, that's when I first got involved in the programs here at the Free Enterprise Institute. The programs taught free market economics and the Constitution. The very first pillar was simple. Nothing in our material world comes from nowhere or goes nowhere. Everything has a source, a destination, and a cost that must be paid, which led directly to the second pillar. Everything that government gives to you, it must first take from you, either in the form of taxes, debt, which represents future taxes, or inflating the currency. Now, that ain't complicated. We're not talking about advanced econometrics. Yet how many people in Washington seem to understand that basic principle, that everything government gives to you, it must take from you? We have got to tell the story. 4 years in high school, I spent hundreds of hours with the Free Enterprise Institute studying Milton Friedman and Hayek and von Mises and Bastiat, and giving speeches all over Texas on free market economics as a kid. Standing at this podium, which I did as a teenager. I didn't actually carve my initials in it, but I probably thought of it. And studying the Constitution, we would tour around, we memorized a shortened mnemonic version of the Constitution, and we would write the Constitution from memory on easels. Then we write a definition of socialism: government ownership or control of the means of production or distribution in an economy. Under the principle, if you don't know what it is, you can't identify it when you have it. And we'd write a quote from Thomas Jefferson: if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. But people do not understand these basic principles. And you know what? It's not their fault. We're not telling them. We're not making the argument. Let me give you a quick example. Remember about a year ago, I was watching on CNBC. A current Republican senator was talking about the corporate tax rate. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world, 35%. U.S. corporations right now have roughly $2 trillion in capital overseas they're not bringing back to the United States because it'd be subject to double taxation at the highest tax rate in the world. And this senator was talking quite sensibly about cutting the tax rate. And the reporter began pushing back, saying, well, what happens if companies don't do what you want them to do? What if they don't build new plants, create new jobs? What if they just give all this money in dividends to their greedy shareholders? And this particular senator just kind of started staring blank-eyed and stammering. And look, I have to admit, once again, I almost put my boot through the television. It's a bad pattern I have. I yell at TV sets. How complicated would it have been for this fellow to say, number one, the premise of your question is ridiculous. If U.S. companies are bringing $2 trillion of capital back to this country, they're going to put a very large portion of that to productive use, generating revenues that's going to produce jobs immediately. But number two, let's accept your premise. Let's assume all $2 trillion of that goes out in dividends. What happens? Number one, the first thing that happens, that's all subject to 15% dividend tax. That's $300 billion in the federal tax revenues tomorrow that weren't there yesterday. But what happens next? You got $1.7 trillion that lands in the account of every shareholder of those companies. Every pension fund, every mutual fund, every little old lady who's invested in those companies. Every one of those owners has two and only two things to do with that money. They can either consume it, they can go out and purchase goods and services which drives demand in the economy, or they can save and invest it, which provides capital for new production and new jobs. Either way, when you have 23 million people struggling to find work, bringing $2 trillion of capital back to this country is unambiguously good. Now, none of that is rocket science. Everyone in this room knows what I just said there. How many people are saying it? We have got to win the argument. I will tell you, I'm looking forward in a couple of months to going up to Washington in January and to manning a beachhead. Manning a beachhead where we're going to be outnumbered and where we're not going to win a lot of these fights. Listen, elections have consequences. The House of Representatives will have the potential to stop some bad things, but we're not going to be able to get a whole lot done with Harry Reid as majority leader and this current president in the White House. But the most important thing we can get done is tell the story, is win the argument, is make the case. These ideas, these policies do not work. They're failing and they are hurting people. And if I ask for your help in that, one of the things I am spending a lot of time with my team talking about right now, what is the most effective way to make that argument, to get the stories out, to get people to understand the incredible promise of free markets, of small businesses, of entrepreneurs, the incredible promise of economic mobility that have made us the freest and most prosperous nation on earth. I intend to spend every day in the U.S. Senate working to be a champion for small businesses, for entrepreneurs, for growth, and for the opportunity it provides. And I'll tell you, the work the Free Enterprise Institute is doing is critical to that. My wife Heidi and I, we personally support the Free Enterprise Institute with our own financial resources, and I thank each of you for stepping forward and committing to doing that. Houston is, I'm convinced, hands down, the most entrepreneurial big city in this country. I'm a Houstonian. I have to admit, when I tour the rest of the state, I have to bite my tongue singing the praises of Houston. Because Houston's a town where nobody cares who your daddy was. We're a town of a bunch of wildcatters. A bunch of people are like, great, what are you doing today? And even better, what are you going to do tomorrow? It is that spirit of freedom that has made Houston and made Texas such an extraordinary economic engine. And I'm convinced Houston and Texas will play the lead, telling the story, making the case to turn this country around. That's what we've got to do. And you know what? I'm convinced it's exactly what we're going to do, because it's what we've done over and over and over again. It is our legacy as Texans and as Americans. God bless you.